Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. And Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Well, good. Well, we have a very interesting subject today. The future of the country, the future of spending, the future of the military budget, the whole works. Of course, we're going to be talking about, will Congress capitulate and do exactly what Donald Trump wants on the spending and, of course, on the taxes. My first impression is that let's hope he gets the tax cuts in. Let's hope he doesn't get the spending increases in. So it's a mixed bag. But the stimulus package is estimated to be maybe worth $1 trillion. And some say, well, even if he gets what he wants, you're not going to see any effect until 2018. But there's euphoria amongst us now. The markets love it. They were desperate. They've been depressed. They were unhappy. They were listening to all the negative things and the unreal figures about unemployment and the inflation and all the things that come up. But they were very depressed, and they needed some hope. And it looks like Trump has given them hope, even as some individuals who were anti-Trump. I didn't know he would be so good. And the stock market is just skyrocketing. The question is the stock market right? A lot of times markets are right, and sometimes they're wrong. Sometimes the stock market wasn't right right before the 2008 crash. The crashes come, and the stocks usually, a lot of people get trapped in them. So the big question is what is coming. But right now, there is euphoria and a lot of hope. If my taxes go down, I'm like others. I like my taxes to go down. Less regulations, that's going to be wonderful. And just to give another extra little boost, we'll spend more money. Maynard Keynes would be happy about that. Stimulus, monetary policy didn't work. Let's spend more money. So that's where we are. So are you an optimist and say yes? We should be hopeful because the Trump plan is going to work, and the Republicans and the Democrats will work together in the Congress and give Trump what he wants.
Well, I think, on the macro level, I think that I'm sure you're right. There are some indications, from Trump that he's at least thinking about spending. For example, he tweeted the other day about the F-35, which we've talked about on the show. Everyone knows it's a boondoggle. It doesn't work. It's grounded. It doesn't fly well. It doesn't fly in bad weather. But he had a tweet saying, something to that effect, that this is the example of the kind of waste he would drop. But it also, actually, the response in the market shows how difficult it would be if he was serious about reining in military spending. The company, Lockheed, lost $4 billion in value from that one tweet. So don't you think that they're going to be willing to spend a few more million on their various think tanks and lobbyists to keep giving us new people to be afraid of, new enemies we've got to keep attacking?
And guess where a lot of that money will go? To the individual congressmen, where they're in pretty solidly, because even now, even with this euphoria with the new administration coming in, these guys, live for their own political sake too, and it's built in 45 different states. It involves a lot of people, and Republicans generally condemn Maynard Keynes, for wanting to spend a lot of money, unless it's military spending. Yeah. So there is such a thing as a military Keynesian thing, because when the Republicans started to complain about what Trump said, doesn't he know how many jobs are involved here? And we have to cut these. We can't cut these, it would hurt the economy. But they don't know the old story about maybe the money would be spent someplace else in a more productive manner. Maybe it would help individuals build a house, or who knows what would happen.
Yeah, the broken window fallacy is perfect. Yeah, it costs jobs. But jobs doing what? Doing something that is not valuable to the rest of the economy.
Well, do you think the F-35 falls into the category where Trump says get rid of waste, fraud, and abuse, but we have to spend a lot more money on the military? I assume that is what he's talking about, but hasn't the Pentagon given us a hint that there is a little bit of waste, fraud, and abuse in the budget that we ought to deal with?
Yeah, this story is funny on a number of fronts, because the Pentagon commissioned a study on administrative waste in the Pentagon. It came back with $125 billion in administrative waste that could be cut. So the Pentagon immediately tried to hide and bury the story.
Oh, I can't believe it.
Yeah. But what's funny, you talk about making a new enemy. This $125 billion just in waste is double the annual defense budget of Russia, the entire country of Russia. So the biggest number one threat against the U.S. spends half as much money on defense as we have in waste.
Maybe we shouldn't be so frightened about talking to Putin and the Russians, and maybe a few less sanctions putting on them. But I don't know. I guess there's more people than McCain and Graham that take the position, no, they're monsters and they're killers and everything else. Yeah, like the Chinese weren't, you know, and that Stalin wasn't when we were his bosom buddy back in World War II. So yeah, I think this is just designed. There's a group out there that are bound and determined to resurrect the Cold War, and this is part of it. And you make the great comparison. How much are they spending on it? And yet, Trump, the conservative, wants to spend more money on the military because our nuclear arsenal needs repaired, and he has a position on nuclear weapons that is contradictory to our position, that you threaten people and intimidate people. So he's going to spend the money. Guess what? Liberals and conservatives are going to support that. And the Congress will roll Trump on this, on the F-35, because in a way, I think what happens is you throw these things out and they sound good. And they remember, Trump wants to cut that waste. But, it'll be lost. I mean, do you think, when is the next time, when it will be the first time we talk about it in the new administration? Who's going to introduce the bill? And will it be mentioned in the State of the Union message? This kind of stuff. I just think it's a lot of grandstanding. It just goes on and on and on, the grandstanding and trying to deceive the people. But there's certainly some things in his plan, and like I said, I like the idea of tax cuts, and that would be very good. Spending increase, I think we don't need to increase any spending. We need to decrease it. But what about this dynamic scoring? Isn't that a fancy little tool that we can use?
Can you explain that? Because it's hard to...
Well, what they do is they say, well, if we, this, you have to pay for it. The Republicans, everybody assumes that if you give a tax cut, if you get to keep more of your own money, that's a cost to government. You owed them $10,000, and if you only have to owe them $5,000, it just costs the government $5,000. They're not saying, well, you just got your money back. You earned the $10,000, not the $5,000. But what they're saying, to keep honest records with dynamic scoring, is you can't cut more than you get in. You have to keep it a balance and make it work out that way. But if you cut taxes, what are you going to do? Are you going to cut spending? No, that's not very popular. You can't cut spending. So what they're saying is, if you or I have a rate of 15 instead of 30, we're going to have more money, so we're going to go out and buy more cars. And therefore, the car dealer is going to make more profits and send more money, to the government. But that generally, doesn't work that way because they can't predict it. And besides, I've always said that this stimulus, it's a supply side argument. You cut spending, and cutting regulations, okay, but you cut taxes and you give a stimulus to the economy, and the government gets more revenue, and they're delighted. But if it worked, which maybe to a degree it would work, you can't make the prediction, you can't use a computer and figure it out, but let's say it did work and you got more money in the Treasury, that means they're still getting too much. That means you cut more spending. And of course, the dynamic scoring is a trick. It's just so that they don't have to match it up and cut. But the real evil in all that is the assumption made by almost all, except for our constitutionalist friends and our libertarian friends. They know that when you cut spending, when you cut taxes, you're not taking it away from the government. You're just getting your own money back. And that's the same way with tax credits or anything, that it's not a cost to government. That's why the concept and the principle of the income tax is so evil, because it makes the assumption the government owns us and we're not a sovereign individual. They own 100% of our income, and if we listen to them and obey them and do what they want, they will allow us to keep a certain percentage. Some people get to keep more. If you're really smart and know how to get it overseas and play these tricks and have loopholes, there always seems to be people, no matter how much they change that tax code, there's always seemed to be a loophole that people are always able to do. Then they say, well, we just have to tighten those loopholes to punish those rich people who know how to do this. No, make it so that average people can do it too, so that they don't have to cough up so much money to the government and fighting people that aren't our enemies, like this thing you mentioned on Russia. You know, they're spending half of what we consider waste at the Pentagon, and we're supposed to be terrified of this. So I would say that the principle, if you're looking at this, the Congress is going to be a tough fight to get the taxes cut, regardless of the philosophic principle there. And I think they're going to get spending increases. They're not going to cut any spending. I've watched it all the way back to the Goldwater days in the 50s and the 60s when they argued you had to cut spending. I just wonder if there was any actual net cut. Maybe. Interesting enough, it might have been immediately after World War II, because there was so much spent, on the World War, and it was so there was some dip then. But basically, spending goes up, taxes go up, size of government goes up, and those nice homes up in Alexandria, Virginia, they keep building them, and they're getting fancier, and the prices are very high, and they always seem to be exempt from the housing bubbles.
Yeah. Well, I'm certainly not an expert in this, but I just look at it. If you want to cut taxes, increase spending, something's got to give. That's got to be the debt, right? And Senator Flake from Arizona makes a good point about what happens to the debt.
Yeah, and I thought he did a nice article on this, and he made one point, which is a point been around, but he reiterated it, and it got some publicity. He was making a point. If you raise interest rates 0.25%, the cost to the taxpayer to pay for interest on the debt goes up $50 billion a year. 0.25%. And right now, interest rates are starting to creep up.
Yeah.
The market's doing it, as well as people are anticipating the Fed, even this week, that they'll raise interest rates. But what happens if it goes up 1 point? Does that mean that it's going to be $200 billion a year extra? But what if we move back into stagflation, and where people are rejecting the whole notion that there is no price inflation, and interest rates go to 4 or 5 or 6? In the 70s, when I started watching this stuff, they went to 15%, and one overnight rate went to 21%. I mean, that would wipe the government out, and this is why they're terrified of this. Of course, what happens here is, don't worry about it. The Fed will always save us. If the market is not providing the funds, the Fed will buy them. But eventually, it does the opposite. The real market will say the dollar's worth less, and the real market will demand higher rates. And there's no way that when that situation comes, that the Fed can rescue us, from the situation they've created. Just like it was impossible for them to rescue us from that dip by QE, just creating trillions of dollars, and the economic growth never came. And so they're not going to do that. The debt is a big deal, even though the issue has been lingering for decades and decades. But we've only been without any link of the dollar to gold since 1971, and before that, there was a lot of debt. But this emphasis, in a way, this is a real trying period. What is going to happen? Will the policies alone that Trump's proposing, will it solve the problem? I think if he got everything he wanted, there would be a blip and maybe some improvement. But your point, what about the debt? The debt is a big deal. And if they don't deal with it, it'll eventually lead to the loss of confidence, more so than now. The reason people don't invest in money, in new businesses, is because they don't have the confidence to go out, and small businesses don't start. And that whole thing has to be changed. I think Trump has given people a sense of optimism, and it's positive, and that's why people are buying stocks again. But how many average people that suffered the consequences, in the last 10 years? There's a lot of people whose real incomes haven't gone up in 16 years, and they're not in the stock market. So it's the people who held the money. The Fed creates all this money, and they're holding, what am I going to do with it? And finally, the place to go. They were in bonds for a long time. But the price of bonds, if you're in bonds, you're losing money because interest rates go up, the value of the bond goes down. There's a lot of big problems there. I think it can be narrowed down to too much spending and too much debt. And the answer to that is not raising taxes. The answer can only be decrease in spending, and it won't happen when you get tremendous support for not doing anything with the Pentagon budget and saying that $125 billion of waste we can ignore and let them hide it. But Heritage, which is pro-military spending but not entitlement, they're always saying cut the entitlement. Well, they have a point too. The entitlements need to be cut. But I think it's such a political suicide trip to say, well, we're not going to touch any of the corporate welfare and military spending, but we're going to cut food stamps to poor people or medical care to the indigent. And I don't think you have to, even though philosophically, I think if we'd have stayed out of that, we'd all be much better off. But there's a way you could. Pick on the things that you can get by, but you can't get it by because the deep state is in charge of this. They're in charge of the military operations and the spending, and that's why these think tanks that you mentioned, they're going to be busy people. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today, and obviously we do not know exactly what's going to happen in the next term, but I would stick to my argument. There's still a lot of problems. It will not be solved by lowering tax rates and lowering regulations and not dealing with spending. You can get a little bit of help there, but you can't mix that in and get enough help if you're willing to increase the spending on infrastructure and the military when you don't need more military. We need more common sense. For these people who are obsessed with starting the Cold War all over again and bashing Russia, of course, Russia's far from a perfect country. They have their problems. But if you look at their excursions outside their border, they're right around them. We're 6,000 miles away, and we have 7 wars going on. And this whole thing and this whole idea that what we need now is Donald Trump to obey and pay homage to the CIA and trust the CIA. If you look to ourselves, we realize that the CIA hasn't told us the truth very often. And like I mentioned just yesterday, I believe that if you wanted promoted in a CIA, what you do is you're a good liar. The better liars got promoted. So this whole idea that you have to bow to the CIA and this bashing of Trump because he appears that he is not bowing to the CIA, and he's not, willing to dump on the relationships they have with Russia. I don't think there's a perfect relationship even if Trump has everything he wants with Russia. I don't think it's a perfect relationship from a libertarian point of view. But it certainly is better than rattling sabers and trying to antagonize and start a war. I just wish Trump would have this similar approach to China and Iran. That's what I wished. And also this whole thing of wanting to reverse some of those things and even not being too happy with what we're doing with Cuba. Why can't we have people sort of follow, a consistent pattern? If peace and cooperation and trade is good, even in an imperfect world, why don't we deal with that rather than saying, no, the answer is confrontation and warmonger and militarism because it's good for jobs, that we can build more airplanes that are probably 50 years out of date. So I think that I hope the euphoria continues. I hope the euphoria of the stock market continues and the economy is exactly what the market is telling us. I have a suspicion, though, that somebody's going to be let down on this because just as something soars, it can go in the opposite direction just as easily. I want to thank everybody today for tuning into the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.